Very excited to have you with us today. The title of our presentation is, What Do You Do Now That Data Quality is in Your DNA? And for those of you that don't know, it's kind of a catchy play on words because Illumina develops and manufactures integrated and array solutions for genetic analysis. So it's kind of a fun little play on words. Next slide, please. I'll introduce some speakers and what's going to be taking place today. So your two moderators today are Sally McCormack. She is the Competency Director for Data Quality at Data Source Consulting, as well as Ken Mudd. He's a manager and material data governance manager overseeing material data governance at Illumina. So thank you. We're very excited to do this joint presentation with one of our favorite clients. So thank you so much. Next slide. About data source consulting, but first just want to cover a few logistics just so everyone can kind of plan as to what's ahead. So the presentation today is about 45 minutes in length. I think you'll find it very engaging with some of the information that we'll be sharing. And at any time, if you have questions, just type them into the questions box that's part of your GoToWebinar. And then at the end of the presentation, we will save 15 minutes to answer those questions. And in the scenarios where we have more questions than we have time to answer, then we will answer those via a group email. So just wanted to let everyone know that we will absolutely make it a point to get your questions answered because truly that's where the good stuff lies. So a little bit about myself. I'm Deborah Langer, Vice President of Sales for Data Source Consulting, and just want to share a little bit of background about Data Source and why we're experts in this space. We are a consulting firm headquartered in Denver, and we specialize exclusively in enterprise data management, data warehousing, and business intelligence. And we divide our services into two categories. The first one is strategic types of services. So this would include data governance, evaluations, and roadmaps that cover people, process, and technology, assessments, program management, project plans, vendor tool evaluation, 3-year blueprinting roadmaps, whatever you might need from a strategic perspective, because sometimes enterprise data management can be overwhelming as far as, how you get your arms around it, what are some of the best practices, how do you approach it. Then the other leg of our consulting services is the implementation piece, and this is our architects and developers and business analysts and data analysts and QA folks and all of those technical people that help us implement and work collaboratively with our client teams to deliver successfully on solutions. So this would include work in data architecture, data integration, data quality, master data management, reporting and analytics, business intelligence, and the ever-growing cloud and hybrid cloud, seeing a ton of movement in that space. So that's a little bit about Data Source Consulting. And if you go to the next slide, right here I'm going to transition to Ken Mudd, who will share a little bit about Illumina and start to take you through the presentation. So welcome everyone, and I'd like to introduce Ken.
Thanks, Deborah. A little bit about Illumina. We were founded in 1998, and we are headquartered in San Diego, California. We have over 5,500 full-time employees and are continuing to grow at a rapid pace. And obviously, we're part of the biotech industry, and as Deborah mentioned, we provide sequencing and array-based solutions for genetic analysis, and Illumina is transforming human health. So a little bit about how we got started. Back in 2013, Illumina launched an initiative called the Global Business Performance. GBP was a group of folks, and their focus was on defining and simplifying and implementing 7 core business processes across the organization. And this was going to help us to grow and scale. As a company, a big component of that was to look at our ERP landscape, and after doing our due diligence, decided to implement SAP. And as part of that, data quality became critical to standardize and cleanse our data prior to migrating data. And with that, once with data or with SAP in place, we had a real need to cleanse that data further as the data was migrated over. And again, we were concentrating on completeness and accuracy of our data, and we continue to do that today.
So now that we have a little bit of background as to why Illumina needed to implement data quality, I just wanted to quickly touch on the importance of having data quality implemented in an organization. According to TDWI, the cost of bad data is more than $600 billion annually in the United States. And here you can see some of the reasons why we would need to have good data quality and the consequences of having poor data quality. You may have a loss of customer or customer satisfaction by having bad data. I'll give you an example of, in my household, my husband and I, we receive mailers, and there's one company that sends us 3 of the same mailers with 3 different names on it. One with my husband's name and myself, one with his name only, and then another with his name misspelled. Now, you can see that that is a waste of money for the company sending us these mailers, because they're sending out 3 mailers to the same customer essentially. And for us, we see it when our name is misspelled. It's not something that we typically like, and we tend not to do business with different companies that don't have our name properly spelled. I also a lot of times will get my name, my maiden name, in mailers, so I typically disregard those companies. Other examples of where bad data may be poor consequences, having misguided business decisions. If you're having data that isn't representative of your sales information, you may be making the wrong decisions and missing out on potential opportunities in other areas of the country, for example. Another example is having a negative company image. A lot of companies today have to follow regulations and standards, and in the news today there's a lot of security breaches. So if their data isn't secure and found, these companies could have a negative company image, resulting in a loss of customers. Also, to that vein, there are financial inaccuracies and mistakes that companies can make, as well as legal and monetary penalties if the data is inaccurate. So now we're going to go into some more specific business drivers as to why Illumina implemented data quality.
Yeah, I'm going to speak to the material and vendor domains. And as you can see, we've listed product to market as one of those business drivers. It's critical for any manufacturing company to be able to purchase items, build items, sell items, and ship items. And to be able to do that with speed, it relies on good quality data at the part number level and at the vendor level. You have to have all of, good standards that lead to good quality data. They're going to impact all of those processes. So also included are reporting inaccuracies, which it's huge for a company that's reporting out from a financial perspective, reporting from a demand and planning perspective, that you are able to get the information that you need to make decisions. That's really huge, and obviously most of you are aware of how important it is to make quality decisions, and data really impacts that. So we also have compliance with another business driver. Deduplication. We wanted to be able to, and this really impacted from a vendor perspective, having duplicate vendors. So when we came over to SAP, we needed to deduplicate vendors, obviously getting rid of the duplicate vendors. So from a material perspective, we didn't have to deal with the deduplication at this time. From a customer perspective, I'm going to let Sally speak to that, because while she was working with us, I was obviously busy with the material and vendor domains, and she kind of took the lead on the customer front, so she'll be able to speak to the business drivers.
And similar to vendor, we had to focus on deduplication. That was a big point for Illumina, because they had both an ERP and a Salesforce.com, where they have their customer information. So there were a number of duplicate customers in the system. One example, I think that there were probably 100-something records for one customer. They got it down to about 24, 25, and then still working down to get it down to, I think, maybe 8 or something like that.
Something like that.
So there was a big need for deduplication, and as part of the deduplication, we needed to really standardize what these names were. So here, a lot of our customers are universities, for example. So how would you standardize a university name? I'll give you the example of UCSC here in San Diego. We could see it as UCSC, UC San Diego, University of San Diego, UNIV of San Diego. So that was just a big reason why we needed to implement data quality, to deduce these records and make sure that the names are standardized. Another business driver was address validation. We need to make sure that our products are being able to be shipped to our customers, as well as making sure we can invoice those customers. So we needed to make sure that the addresses were standardized in a USPS mailable format. And also, we need to make sure that we are targeting the right customers. If we have our customer data updated and cleansed, we would be able to reach those customers and also be able to segment them correctly. Now, in order to do this, we came up with a plan, and this was our action plan. We first established a data governance charter. We made sure to target the right audience and identified the owners of the data and the managers. We explained it simply, communicated the process throughout, moved quickly to get it done. Now Ken's going to talk about the data governance charter.
Yeah, so what we were doing and why we were doing it. So we were establishing tools and processes that would support our data governance program. Part of the tools, we implemented Informatica as a tool with our selection to manage quality. We worked on the process around how data quality was going to impact the company and what the expectations were going to be out of the participants in our program. We obviously wanted to implement data quality, as I mentioned before, to ensure completeness and accuracy of our data. And from a scope perspective and how we were doing it, we were enabling Illumina to monitor data based on our business rules for master data. And so that required us to go out and really communicate and meet with the business for several weeks to get the right business rules. Impacts and risk, we were simply flagging data in our IDQ environment, and so we weren't impacting current systems. We weren't modifying anything in our current systems. Our business rules, they were applied in our IDQ environment, so again, we weren't impacting anything in our production environments. Current operations, again, the actions that were taken were only going to be relevant and only occur as needed. So really flagging data and only going to take action as needed. So part of that flagging process required our subject matter experts and our data stewards to make decisions based on these flags and not just simply be, data coordinators and just throw into the system what our IDQ environment was validating. We wanted people who understood the business rules to actually align to our reporting that was coming out of the system. So there really was a knowledge that we required of our data stewards. And again, we weren't going to negatively impact our current state because we were simply just flagging data. So our target audience, a big part of the kickoff of our program was identifying the right business partner. We wanted to quickly identify those folks who had direct accountability to the data. We wanted to identify the folks that were owners of the resources, the folks that entered the data. And at the top of our list were teams that had immediate pains to be solved. A big key component to that was really engaging the VP prior to even going out and finding the data stewards. We wanted to let the VPs across the organization know what we were doing, brought data that was impacting their world, and kind of walked them through why data quality was important. And we started to immediately see eyes light up that data was truly important, even if the folks didn't understand the granularity of the data. They still understood that it was impacting their world and the world of their peers across the organization. So, and I'll also touch, we obviously got our VP up to speed because he was in charge of helping us kick this off and actually putting it as an initiative of his for the group, right? So you really want to get it, you want to bring it to the highest level and start to drive down from the top. So how we identified owners and managers, again, like I mentioned, we wanted to identify those folks who actually enter the data on a daily basis. We wanted to, what was really important was to get their perspective on how they use the data, right? We wanted to hear it firsthand, understand their process, what made them enter data the way they entered it, or how they made decisions on the right values to populate in various attributes. We wanted to get cross-functional people who are impacted by the data, which I would classify as a subject matter expert. And I can't tell you how important subject matter experts are to our program. They help us with rule development. They kind of keep a pulse on the data steward community, where there's training that's needed, where a process is broken. I mean, I rely on 2 or 3 subject matter experts, one from supply chain, one from finance, and one from our master data team, and they are constantly meeting with me about issues that they see crop up. And again, it could be from process, it could be from just training. So it's really important. That I can't highlight how important that piece is. And then again, this kind of goes back to the second bullet about getting the perspective from the data users. We didn't want to let IT business analysts tell us how the data is used. We obviously took that into consideration, but it really wanted to hear from the data steward. How is the data being used? Which really highlights the last part, which is hear the information firsthand.
So now that we've identified who should be involved in this program, essentially, we explained data quality simply. And these are just 6 of the common data quality dimensions. You can see here completeness was one that we used quite a bit of. It was really figuring out what data is missing or unusable. And you can see here this example just has missing address elements. Conformity, what data is stored in a non-standard format. Here you can see the phone numbers are in different formats. So that was part of the standardization as well, and conforming name standards, for example. Consistency, what data values are giving conflicting information. You can see here these 2 records are 2 different transactions, but they have the same transaction ID. So if we have bad data with the same transaction ID, we could be incorrectly calculating our sales, for example. Accuracy was another one that we used, and that's really looking at what data is incorrect or out of date. In this example, you can see that there's incorrect address elements or missing address elements. And then duplicates was another. As I mentioned before, we had a number of duplicates in the customer data, so really figuring out which, in this case, which John Smith is the correct one. And there's also integrity, where you're looking to see what data is missing or not referenced. In this example, you can see that there's a customer ID missing. And there's other dimensions as well, timeliness of when is the data populated and things like that. But we focus mostly on completeness, consistency, and accuracy, and duplicate. So we then communicated the overall data quality process, and I want to really stress that it is a set of processes, technologies, and people involved in ensuring the conformance of data values to meet business needs and requirements and satisfy acceptance criteria. It isn't just a tool, it isn't just people, it's not just the process, it's all 3 of these. So we stress the importance of that, as well as stressing that this is a very iterative process. So we start off by profiling, then defining the rules, designing, implementing, monitoring, and then taking action. It's very iterative, and there's constant collaboration with the business and IT, and we made sure to communicate that so that they understood it wasn't going to be, okay, here are my requirements, we're done. No, we're going to have to be going back and forth multiple times.
So move quickly. This is one of Illumina's core values. You know, when you come to interview at Illumina, you spend a great deal of time in an interview talking about how you move fast and embrace change. And so this program really kind of kept to that value. And so we were, you know, from a moving quickly perspective, it involved data profiling, so obviously identifying data inconsistencies so that you could then go move into the defining of business rules based on the output of your profiling of data. So that involved a lot of collaboration across the business. And so that's another value of Illumina. So this program really does kind of integrate with Illumina's values. We collaborated deeply on the business rules, right? Because as a governance lead, I don't make the business rules. I just kind of collaborate with teams to get them so that my team can go in and build those business rules into our IDQ system so that we're bringing out meaningful data. Then we reprofile, which goes right back into this iterative process. And I've mentioned over and over at other times when I've talked about this subject, we touch our rules several times, at least we have in the last year. I think we've touched, of the 40 rules that we had in the system at the end of last year, we probably touched each of those at least 2 times, on an average of 2 or 3 times. And so we start over and we keep doing this exercise until we get it just right. And we keep providing more meaningful and more meaningful information based. And the reason they iterate is because the business changes, right? Our business changes quite frequently, so we have to update our rules. So we're bringing them meaningful information at the time we release them. It's just things change. So we just dealt with production data only. We felt like anything else was just a waste of time. Basically pointed our IDQ environment from our IDQ dev environment to our production data source so that our users were able to see meaningful data that they work with in our live system.
So how did we actually get this done? What we did was we identified what systems, databases, and tables, flat files, whatever we needed to have data quality implemented on. We identified those first off. And then what we did was we acquired that data. And we'll show you a diagram after this slide. But you know, we couldn't directly source SAP, so we had to acquire that data. And you know, there were different methods in acquiring that data. You know, we could leverage a replicated environment. We could use ETL. You know, potentially use the existing data warehouse. So really, we had to consider where we would get this data from, and we actually then staged that information. Once we acquired data, we performed base profiling. So this was really at the beginning to look and understand the data just as it is. You know, for example, here with SAP, Mara is our material table, and we just profiled that entire table, even all 100-something columns of it, right? I mean, there's a lot of data, but at least it gave us a good picture as to what it looked like, and also helped with determining first off, okay, these 20 columns, they don't even have data in it, so we don't need to include them at all. So really, we started off with the base profiling and then built in more complex profiling a little bit later. And then we started with creating our rule sheet, which was, like Ken mentioned, we had many meetings with them to define the rules. You know, it was a lot of emails, a lot of meetings, and now we have a form that they fill out that they can submit their requested rule. But initially, as we were kicking it, it was just a lot of tight collaboration and constant collaboration. And, you know, we'd get rules and emails, and then, you know, Ken and I would be like, what is he saying? And so we'd have to set up a meeting to clarify what they were asking for. And I think once we got into the cadence of what we were looking for in the rules, that definitely improved, and now they get the hang of it, so they can just submit it through a form. So this is the data quality process at Illumina. Here, as I mentioned, we acquired the data first from SAP, and we loaded it into a staging area. From there, we profiled that information, and we reviewed those results and just started defining the rules. And we actually put these rules in a rule specification document, which is just a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet that we started off with initially, posted on Box. And then we took those rules and developed them within Informatica Data Quality. We created LDOs, maplets, and reference tables with those rules, applied those rules to the profile, and then created an IDQ scorecard to show how the rules were doing over time. The end user would then review those results, both in the scorecards and the profiles, and then take action where needed, whether that might be updating the source system, maybe updating reference table values, or maybe working with the data governance team to redefine the rules. As Ken mentioned, the business rules, they do change often, and I think as they're getting more comfortable with the rules, they're getting more complex with them as well. So they start off maybe, oh, well, this value has to be populated. And then down the road, we revisit and we say, actually, we need to look at this value if this other field is populated and add maybe a specific list of valid values as a reference table to look up to. Now, part of this process, we initially started off with steps 1, 2, 3, and 5, and we added in step 4 at the very end, where we actually built a data quality data mart. We pulled the data from IDQ and actually created a separate data mart and put Tableau on top of it to really look at the data more at a process level. And that is definitely still being worked on. It hasn't been rolled out quite yet, but the intent is to have that so that it can push those reports out to the users and make it a little bit easier to report up to upper management. So I'll go through the steps in a little bit more detail. The first thing that we did, as we mentioned, was just profiling of the data. We want to make sure that we're looking at the data and determining what should be cleansed and modified, and definitely helps in defining our rules. So in this example here, this is certain statuses for material data. You can see Z4 has a lot of values in it, and from this you could say, well, you know what, we should make sure that this status should have these values, and we could easily create a reference table with the values seen here. We also could see, well, we don't really care about Y1 status, and that would be 18% of our records. If we included that status in our record set, then that may, inaccurately reflect what our data quality scores are. So it also helps in defining what filters we want to apply with the data. So, as we mentioned, we started off with profiling off of the production environment. Our dev and test and production environments all point to the production source environment, in this case, our source staging data. And we made sure to profile often and all of the data. The data volume here isn't in the millions and millions of records, so it was easy for us to profile all of the data. And you can sample when you're profiling, but you could be missing out on certain elements. So we definitely encourage everyone to profile all of the data when possible. We started off with a PDO, which is a physical data object in IDQ, and that's essentially just the base table. We then created an LDO, which is a logical data object, by joining multiple tables together and then applying the rules, as you can see in the screenshot here, in that one LDO. And an LDO is essentially just a virtual representation of the data. So we were able to join this data together without having to create another staging layer to load this data and profile on top of that. We were able to just leverage the LDO and profile from there. Once we profiled our data, we looked at those results and defined the rules. And this is just a basic example. Our rules template has changed over time as we figure out what is important to capture. But in this case, we're looking at the views essentially in SAP, and then we looked at the database tables after that. Our users are looking at SAP, so they're not going to necessarily know what the table is. So we just ask them to get that view information, and we can work to get the database information. One important thing was really understanding who owned the data. We have had people request rules, but then they don't want to own it. So then when the data is very bad and the score is 60%, no one wanted to take action, actually cleanse the data. So we do have one rule that I think is still waiting for an owner. Maybe hopefully.
That's one of those things where I would advise against creating rules where you don't have somebody who commits to owning. Yes, we do have one rule because it's owned by a large department, and each part number can be accounted for by one individual or 10 different individuals. So it's really difficult. So I would advise having an ownership before even creating the rule, or it'll just sit there.
And then your scores will be bad.
And your scores are bad, and people will say, who owns this? And you'll say, well, a big department owns this. And so we at least need somebody to manage the report.
Right.
And they can go and chase down the individuals that can speak to the data.
Right. That was one of the things that we learned. And then also while we're defining the rules, we want to make sure that these rules are solving business problems and not just looking at the data just to create a rule just because we want to have it. It should be really focused on what the business issues are. We defined manipulation rules, which are really, for example, address standardization or name standardization to cleanse and standardize that data, and then validation rules to validate that the value is correct. And as we're defining validation rules, we want to make sure that we're keeping the manipulation rules in mind. So if you're standardizing a name, you want to make sure that you cleanse that first and then validate that afterwards. One big thing too was making sure that we prioritize the rule. Because when we initially rolled this out, everybody was like, oh yeah, I've got a rule here. Emails came flooding in, these rules, but we really had a limited number of resources to work on this, and then we wanted to make sure that we had some quick wins. So really we focused on prioritizing the rules so that we could have multiple releases, and that way people could see the value of having data quality and data governance in place versus waiting a year or two before ever seeing anything if we waited until the end. And we also prioritized, to that vein, also the different data domains. We started with material data first because we had the resources available, and we knew that there were a lot of issues that we could quickly point out and apply data quality rules for. Then we went on to vendor because that was the next where we actually had resources available and also had a good understanding of the data, and then moved on to customer. And you would think that you want to do customer first, but there were a lot of other initiatives going on with customer that needed to happen before we could then really focus on understanding what a customer is and applying the data quality rules to it. And during this phase, like we mentioned, we had to really communicate that it's important to be iterative in this process. So we made sure that the data stewards understood that rule changes are inevitable. And during this phase, we also considered what reference tables or valid lists of values would be. So, from the rule definition, we then developed the rules within IDQ. And what we did was we actually created separate projects for each data domain, meaning all the material rules were separate, all the customer rules were separate, all the vendor rules were separate. But we did come up with some standard global reusable rules that we could use across the different folders. So, for example, our basic rule of it must be populated. That's just a basic rule. You just have one input of standard 400 string length and an output. So that was a standard rule that we could use in the different project folders. And then we also created rules per column. So in this case, we've got a rule for material status. We've got a rule for storage conditions. We've got a rule for what else? No, there's so many out there. So we really just had one rule per field, essentially, because we had specific owners who understood, okay, for storage conditions, well, that one is the one that we have issues with. But that one, we had specific people who could really understand what that value would be. And then as part of rule development, we applied the rules in the LDO rather than in the profile. In IDQ, you can apply the rule directly in the profile, but we applied it in the LDO, and we matched that output to a separate column in the profile because it was easier for us to pull that information out of the repository for our data mart, as well as performance issues. It just was faster for us to apply it directly in the LDO than in the profile itself. So here's an example of a profile. Here you can see that we applied the rule material valuation, valuation class. In this case, we applied it, and you can see that there's 98.94% valid and 1.06% invalid, which is pretty good overall. But again, based on your data set, there's still about 3,000 records that are invalid. So with the profile created with the rule applied, the data steward can go and look at those invalid records. You're able to drill down within Informatica and pull that out, and then they can evaluate it in SAP and determine what action needs to be taken. After creating the profiles, we then creating mappings to essentially load the data to a physical table for our data mart. And in this case, we had that same LDO material valuation with the rules applied and loaded it into our fact table. This entire process, we leveraged an enterprise scheduler called SkyBot, and this is just an example of all of the profiles and scorecards just for material that we had to create. We actually had to create these at different grains just because of how the data is being pulled. Rules for material master may not be applicable to rules for material at the plant level, for example. So after this implementation, the next step of the process is monitoring the data quality.
Yeah, a big component of that is reviewing invalid records, determining whether the data is going to be updated in the source system. So we touched on that earlier about making sure your data stewards or your data owners really understand the data that's being extracted out of the IDQ environment, that we're not just making hasty decisions to update because a tool flagged it that way. We still need to look at our data. Based on our invalids, we have to determine, does it make sense? If yes, then we update the system with the right logic, or we update the systems with the right data. And if we don't agree with the invalids, then we have to decide whether the rule needs to be updated, whether there's a reference table that needs to be updated, or whether the business process has changed and we need to kind of reinvent the rule to fit new business logic. So next slide.
So now that we monitored and took action, really, how do we continue this momentum? How does data governance and data quality work together? Here at Illumina, data quality is part of data governance, and data governance is actually really responsible, as you can see here, for the data accountability and stewardship, and making sure that the data is defined and there's an understanding across all of the different business groups here. Data governance is really responsible for orchestrating the data stakeholders, and it's more preventative and more of a business focus. Not to say that data quality isn't, but in this case, typically, data quality would work together with data governance to get that business information and then translate that into, reusable rules and develop that process. Data quality is really about discovering the data and cleansing it and doing monitoring of it. So we're taking action and flagging the data So it's more reactive, and it is more of an IT focus, but the two definitely go hand in hand together.
Yeah, so I'll just kind of speak to our data governance and how we have it laid out. From a data and accountability stewardship perspective, we implement what we call, I'm sure most of you have heard of a RACI, and probably some have heard of a RASCI. We added the S for support because we have a lot of folks in the company that actually provide support in a lot of the areas of accountability. So one of my tasks at the end of last year was to create an all-encompassing RASCI chart that kind of gets rid of the finger pointing about who owns an attribute or a process or where somebody fits in a project, a part of a project. So we created a big matrix and went out after that matrix was filled out with the R's, the A's, the S's, the C's, and the I's. We went out and before publishing, went to each of the leaders of our functional areas and excuse me, said, here's what we have laid out. Here are the roles of the folks on your team, and here's where they fit in the whole process for whatever domain we were talking about. And once we got their buy-in, we published that document, and we reference it whenever we see finger pointing or somebody says, I don't think I own that. So it's helped out, and obviously it's a work in progress, and that document will continue to grow. Monthly reporting, we have a group, our supply chain team does a phenomenal job of taking the data that we pull out of our IDQ environment and reports on that. And they hold their people accountable, and they've given them KPIs to meet as it pertains to their owners, their rules of ownership. We report out at the attribute level, and the supply chain has names to each of those attributes. So we see a lot of good progress happening from a supply chain perspective. I mean, I would say there are stars for today, and everybody are gradually, we have our other domains like finance and quality, they're catching up as well. I think supply chain has more resources to throw. For whatever reason, they report out, and so I think that their VPs are really engaged. So we also have a data definition and understanding component. So this is kind of part of, we listed it, but I think this is really part of our roadmap for next year. I mean, obviously we have data standards, and those are pretty well defined, but from a data governance tool, that is on our roadmap for next year, where we can actually formalize our governance technology and have a system that houses our business glossary and our data lineage. So that's really going to be an important part of end of this year initiative and through next year to really get the business engaged and give them tools to be able to help us keep standards and the business glossaries up to date. Orchestration of data stakeholders. We have a data governance community that we do once a month, and that's where we report out the scores at the domain level. And we also break it down into functional areas and kind of report out on that. And we talk about challenges that teams are having and what can we do, are the rules up to date, just anything and everything. What new rules do you have? And we will start to get planning for the next month to start putting new rules together. I started doing bi-weekly functional team meetings where I start asking questions about why rules are still kind of in the same state they were 2 months ago, and what I can do to help them move forward. Is there any kind of assistance they need from a cleansing perspective? And so we just start that dialogue. And another part of my responsibility is I also manage the ServiceNow tickets, which is our help desk ticket-based system. We have a data steward queue where data issues get kind of thrown into this queue, and I assign them to the folks that are responsible for whatever attribute is being reported as an incident. And I'll ask about why those tickets are still outgoing. And so since I've started calling these meetings, I've seen better response to their areas of responsibility. And we have preventive, from a preventive component, we have a monthly, what we call a graph meeting. And so what that really is it's a group of us that get together and we talk about change management issues that are coming up, and we talk about any changes that are going to happen in the system and whether they're going to impact data quality. We've started to integrate ourselves with our ServiceNow platform to put governance flags so that when people submitting tickets go in to create a ticket, they can check this data quality flag. If they don't know, they still need to check the data quality flag so that we can actually make the decision for them. We can discuss. This is a meeting full of folks from all the different functional areas. We have a monthly architect community meeting where we will go and start talking about trends that are happening. We're asking about trends because we have a pretty technical team in this room, and so a lot of them are going around to different conferences and such, and so they may have heard about a tool that might interest us. We'll talk about challenges that we have from a data quality perspective, and so it's just a collaborative type of meeting that we're all in. So from a business focus, obviously data governance is part of the IT organization, but we really do work closest with our business folks to govern data. And then next, from a data quality perspective, we obviously data discovery, we've touched on that, and data cleansing, implementing validation rules, develop a controlled mass update process. When I started here, we had over 100 people that had the ability to update master data in mass, which is startling. It really should be less than 10 people, if that. It really should be your master data team that can mass update data, but it was out of control a little bit, and so we part of one of my initiatives last year was to get that group of people down to less than 20, and so we've got it's more controlled, and we're doing much better there. And obviously data quality monitoring, we have daily scorecarding that goes out to the folks who are the data stewards or data owners for the respective attributes that we report on. Monthly metric reporting, we touched on that. And as Sally talked about, it's reactive flagging by flagging invalid records on a daily basis. So we don't directly update in the source system. And an IT focus is implementation of automated DQ processes and tools, which we talked about, a data governance tool that'll be in our roadmap in the next 6 months. So key takeaways today would be that data governance and data quality initiatives are communicated from the top. That's where you're going to get your biggest success, your biggest wins. We are aligning data quality and data governance to all our data initiatives in the organization. One of our big initiatives is data transformation. That came down from our CEO. So we will be, we're trying to align what we do throughout this year and next year to that initiative specifically. So obviously data quality must provide business value. If we don't provide business value, you're not going to get any movement. Ensure right data owners are involved. That is huge. That's huge. I mean, don't even bother with data quality if you don't have the right data owners involved. And then below that is obviously getting the right data stewards who are going to go and cleanse the data because they care about it, because they understand the downstream impacts of the data they enter. That, those are all things that need to be considered. And then communicate the iterative nature of data quality. We've used that word 10,000 times in the last year with everybody in this company. It's iterative, it's iterative, it's iterative. That means it's going to change. By the way, it's going to change. So just they have to understand that, and it has nothing to do, if it changes, it has nothing to do with them as the person who defined the rule. It's just the nature of the business changing. It's nobody's fault. And I just need to be comfortable with the fact that if something changes, it's not necessarily their fault. Could be their fault, but probably not. And then creating a standard process for rule creation and updates, which is what we've done by creating a form, and it's gone a lot smoother. So their first pass is to try to create the logic on their own. They submit a form through a ServiceNow ticket, and then we look at the rule, and if we can make sense of the logic, we will develop the rule and send it back for UAT. If we can't make sense of the logic, then we call a meeting. We used to just call meetings for everything, and now it's just gotten way too busy, so we don't do that anymore. Recurring meetings help. I mean, I was seeing certain functional areas where their rule quality wasn't getting any better, or that their ServiceNow tickets were staying open. And so by calling these recurring meetings and having them actually answer to things get cleaned up. Now, I will say this, that the quality would only get better about the next day after I talked to them. I'd see a big increase in quality or suddenly ServiceNow tickets are closed. So, but it still helps.
So you can see how valuable it is to have data governance to help drive the data quality, because you're really driving that. You know, a lot of times people, this is their, you know, they have their other day job, right?
Yep.
So they're not really focused on data quality, and I think that's, you know, important to point out is data governance really helps to drive that.
Exactly. All right. So, and as Sally pointed out, data value is all about data quality and data governance working together. And so, just to share a little bit about our results today, obviously we have automated data quality process for material and vendor data domains, and I'll add customer. As of last week, we implemented our customer domains into our IDQ system. And better data, less risk. Our material data quality today is at 98%. We were at 87% April of last year. So that's a nice jump. And so we will increase our scope to include other high-profile data objects such as BOM. We are going to come out with we have a project that we're kicking off this summer on cleaning up BOM information. And so we will be heavily involved in creating rules around our BOM data. And we will continue to profile and define additional rules, and that will never stop. And then obviously we will continue to mature our data governance program and visibility, visibility is huge, and that all starts with having conversations with people you may not be comfortable with, right? So DPs can be your biggest advocates. They can help you drive serious change. And now I'm gonna turn this back over to Deborah for questions.
Perfect. Thank you, Ken. And just for anyone that doesn't know, BOM stands for Bill of Materials, just so people know. Didn't want them to think it was other BOM data. Thank you so much, Ken and Sally. The way that was laid out and presented, personally, I thought it was very clear and concise, and I especially like the results slide at the end because that's what it's all about. And sometimes with data quality and data governance initiatives, it can be hard to measure. So very insightful to see the results at the end. We have had a number of questions already come in, and we've got 7 minutes left, so let's go ahead and get right to those. One of the first ones that have come in is, were there corrective data quality actions taken via bulk update, data steward data entry, or both?
So the data.
Oh, go ahead,
Sally.
Go ahead, please.
I was going to say, so the data, we flagged the data, and there were some cases where there were bulk or mass updates.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of mass updates in the beginning. Yeah. I mean, we were taking huge swipes at data in the beginning.
And that was directly in SAP.
Correct.
And then, there are some, too, where, depending on how many are invalid, there may just be a handful. So sometimes they'd actually just go in the system and then update it directly. But yeah, a lot of it was more mass.
I think in the beginning, since we had engaged our master data team who had access and were appropriately trained in doing things with math, a lot of our initial success happened with large swipes of data, thousands of records getting updated at once.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for that. Next question, any lessons learned, such as, success or horror stories that you might include with regards to address validation?
So, I mean, I don't want to say any horror stories, but I would say with address validation, it's also very iterative. Address Doctor is kind of a black box, from Informatica. You can define your input, you get your output, but really you don't know what it's doing to your address. So even if you pass it in the first time, you may get an unexpected result. So you have to pass your data multiple times. I would just make sure that you plan for enough time to actually do the address validation piece of it. And, sometimes with our data, there could be, names in address line 1. So what do we do there? So it's, going through the process, iterating, and making sure that you profile even after you put the data through Address Doctor. So, for us to be successful is really making sure that we had enough time dedicated to focus on address validation.
Thanks, Sally. Thanks. Another question that has come in is with regards to data governance. Is this an area where Illumina will consider possibly leveraging a tool, or will you address this primarily through people and process?
So obviously people and process is where everything is going to start, and we will definitely be using a tool. I think I mentioned that we are in the middle of doing a POC with the vendor to start to so what we found out is that we need something. The business is the key to some really valuable information, right? Obviously the definitions and the glossary, we need their help to at least start the process of putting together definitions. And we need a tool that can allow workflow, that the appropriate validation workflow, right? Approval workflow. And so yes, we will definitely be using a tool. Probably have it sourced by the end of the summer.
Okay, great. And then I think we've got time for one more, and it's a pretty broad question, but what's next for Illumina? I know that you had mentioned that you'll possibly be folding in additional sources and data elements, but is there a roadmap that Illumina is looking to follow?
Yeah, absolutely. We are looking, I think from the beginning, we talked a little bit about the ability to map our data. We need to implement data lineage or have a tool around data lineage, because people are making decisions about attributes in our system via whether it's customer, vendor, or material. We need to be able to have some lineage to understand impacts to these decisions, because some of the people who are making these decisions to change something don't have a really broad end-to-end view of where that data is flowing. And so that's going to be one of our initiatives. Another one of our initiatives is we recognize how valuable it is for our senior leadership team to be engaged and start driving down results, so that we are going to start, and I think Sally had mentioned we're going to bring business process into how we report out on our rules. Right now we report out at a profile level, so we have a basic material level, we have a plant level. Well, we want to take those attributes and start folding them into a business process, so that when we deliver it to a senior team, they'll see that, oh, our procurement process is 90%, and they can drill into that and see what is impacting that process. So that's going to be something else that's part of our roadmap.
Great. Thank you so much, Ken. Really appreciate that. Let's move to the very last slide. First, I want to thank Sally and Ken. Thank you, Sally, for putting your pictures up there. Thank you again so much for your time today to share this case study, because I love case studies. I'm a huge fan of them, because I think, hearing the story, how it progressed, some of the challenges faced, and then, like I mentioned earlier, the results, I just think it's so powerful to kind of have the visual for something beginning to end. So thank you so much for your time. Wanted to queue up if this was of interest. Our educational webinars continue on July 27th at 11 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. Our Solomon Williams, our Enterprise Data Management Director of Solutions, will be presenting a use case on MDM. So for those of you that are in attendance and are considering MDM, please join us for that next one. So I'm going to go ahead and close things up. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and thank you to our presenters. Have a great rest of your day and a very safe and happy July 4th. Take care.